So how do you take down a global empire? You might think, armies, maybe an invasion. But what if I told you it can be done with a single phone call? You see, back in 1956, the United States taught the world a really brutal lesson. In our modern age, true power is not just about controlling land, it is about controlling the money. What happened to the British Empire back then is, well, a chilling blueprint for how a superpower can be brought to its knees using the invisible weapon of debt. And to understand how this could happen again, we have to start with a truly massive number: $38.6 trillion. Yeah, that is the projected US national debt for early 2026. I mean, it is a number so huge it almost breaks your brain, right? But here's the thing. Behind that number is not just some boring budget problem. It is a potential weapon aimed right at the heart of American power. And that really gets us to the big question of this entire explainer. Is this mountain of debt a fatal weakness? You know, the modern-day equivalent of an army's exposed flank. A vulnerability that a rival could exploit in just the right crisis. Well, to find the answer, we have to go back in time about 70 years to another empire that was absolutely convinced it was invincible. So let us go back to 1956. The United Kingdom still controlled a huge global empire. The British pound was the currency for half of all world trade. I mean, on the surface, Britain was an absolute titan. But hidden just beneath all that imperial pageantry was this deep structural weakness, a fragility that almost nobody saw coming. Now, you might look at this chart and think, hey, things are looking up for Britain, right? Its debt to GDP ratio was actually falling pretty steadily after World War II, down to 128% by 1956. But this chart is really deceptive. It hides the real danger: who Britain owed all this money to. And here is the kicker. It was its own colonies. This vulnerability had a name: the sterling balances. Think of it like this. Britain was basically acting as the world's banker, but its vaults were almost empty. Countries all over the globe held British pounds. And if they all decided they wanted their money back at the same time, well, Britain could not pay. The pound would completely collapse. It was a ticking time bomb. And I cannot overstate just how shaky the situation was. British officials knew they were staring down a psychological red line: $2 billion. They believed that if their reserves of gold and dollars dipped below that number, the markets would panic. And by 1956, their reserves were hovering at just $2.2 billion. They were walking a financial tightrope with absolutely no safety net. Now, every good trap needs a trigger. And for Britain, that trigger was a 100-mile ditch dug through the Egyptian desert, the Suez Canal. The fight over this little waterway would expose Britain's weakness and give the United States the perfect opening to spring the trap. So on July 26, it happened. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser seized control of the canal. For British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, this was way more than just a business dispute. It was an existential threat. The canal was the jugular vein of the empire, the critical artery for oil and trade. Eden started seeing Nasser as a new Mussolini, and he became completely obsessed with the idea of taking him down. The Americans were pushing for diplomacy, but Britain and France had other ideas. They went behind America's back. They held a secret meeting with Israel and cooked up a plot. It was a classic bait and switch. Step 1. Israel would invade Egypt. That would give Britain and France the perfect cover to swoop in as so-called peacekeepers and, just happen to seize the canal in the process. And each of these plotters had their own secret reasons for getting involved. Britain wanted the canal back and Nasser gone. France wanted to stop Nasser from helping rebels in its colony, Algeria. And Israel? Well, it wanted to end the Egyptian blockade of its southern ports. They all shook hands on it, and the plot was set in motion, completely behind the back of their most powerful ally, the United States. The invasion kicked off on October 29, 1956, and militarily, it was working. But politically, oh, it was a total catastrophe. President Eisenhower was absolutely furious that he had been lied to, especially right before his re-election. But he did not send in the Marines. No, he reached for a different kind of weapon, one that was way more powerful. He launched the first purely financial war in modern history. I mean, the financial mismatch here was just staggering. Britain had only $2.2 billion left to defend the pound. The United States, meanwhile, was holding over $3.7 billion worth of British government bonds. America had more than enough financial firepower to bankrupt Britain overnight. And they were about to pull the trigger. America's attack came in 3 devastating waves. First, it used its veto power at the International Monetary Fund to block a crucial emergency loan for Britain. Strike 1. Second, it froze other loans Britain desperately needed to buy oil, now that the canal was closed. Strike 2. And then came the final, fatal blow. The US Treasury threatened to start dumping its huge holdings of British bonds onto the open market. This would have started a global panic, crashed the pound, and made Britain insolvent. Checkmate. And this was the moment of surrender. On November 6, the British Chancellor, Harold Macmillan, got off a phone call with Washington. He walked straight into a cabinet meeting, looked right at the Prime Minister, and made it clear that the game was up. His words, "I am not prepared to be responsible for the pound." Think about that. British troops were still advancing in Egypt, but their empire had just been defeated. Not by an army, but by a phone call from their banker. The Suez Crisis effectively ended the British Empire and marked the final rise of the American one. But you know, history has a funny way of rhyming. Fast forward 70 years, and the United States finds itself in a financial position that looks, well, hauntingly similar to Britain's back in 1956. About 124%. That is America's projected debt-to-GDP ratio for 2025. Just like Britain back then, the US is a global military power whose incredible reach is funded by massive borrowing. And just like Britain back then, a big chunk of that debt is held by foreign powers. And some of them, well, they are not exactly America's friends anymore. Now, it is true that most US debt is held by Americans. But look at that slice for foreign holders. Over a quarter of it, more than $9 trillion, is owned by other countries. This gives those nations a powerful lever over the US economy, the exact same kind of lever America once pulled on Britain. And this chart shows a really clear geopolitical fault line. On one side, you have America's traditional allies there, buying more US debt. But on the other, you have its strategic rivals, nations like China, Brazil, and India, and they are actively selling it off. It almost looks like they are systematically disarming America's bond weapon, so it cannot be used against them in the future. So what could trigger a modern Suez moment for America? It might not even start with a financial crisis. It might start with a geopolitical one. something that shatters the world's perception of American power and forces everyone to suddenly rethink what the US dollar is actually worth.
Analysts point to a few key scenarios. A failed defense of Taiwan could destroy US credibility in Asia. A crisis that closes the Strait of Hormuz for a long time could cripple the global economy and show the limits of American naval power. Or maybe it is not one big event. Maybe it is a slower, more gradual hollowing out of alliances as nations quietly start to pivot away just to make sure they do not get caught in a financial trap themselves. The lesson of Suez is crystal clear. Financial independence is basically a myth when your rivals are also your bankers. The British Empire did not end with a bang. It ended with a margin call. And as America tries to navigate the 21st century, the real question is not just about who has the most aircraft carriers. It is about who owns the debt. Because in this new great game, ultimate power might not belong to the nation with the biggest army, but to the one holding the world's credit card.